Let's take a look at some of the ways artists apply an understanding of the underlying structure of the rectangle to their drawings. As we analyze their work, you'll have the opportunity to put these concepts into practice. For your drawings, you'll need pencils, sharpening tools, erasers, and a drawing board. You'll also need your viewfinder, some printer paper or a sketchbook of a similar size, and some very simple still life objects. For this project, the simpler the better. Choosing the right kind of rectangle for a given drawing is crucial. The drawing's basic character will be flavored by that choice. Generally, artists choose to orient the format in sympathy with the subject. While there's no rule about this, you'll find that most landscapes and still lifes are horizontal, most full-length portraits are vertical, except when the subject's lying down. Now, most people do this instinctively, even when they're taking a snapshot. Unlike a snapshot, we can decide exactly how vertical or horizontal to make a drawing. In the examples, you'll note that each drawing uses a unique rectangle, some more vertical, some more horizontal, some more square. Each makes use of specific shapes and divisions to structure the drawing. Generally, artists want the various parts of the drawing to relate to one another, and they want to construct a unified whole out of the parts. So we'll often find that the largest shapes, the object and ground, and the aggregate shapes relate to the drawing's armature. Here's a drawing by Rembrandt. You'll note the uniquely shaped rectangle. Just about every one of his works has a unique format shape. While the subject's a landscape, the underlying compositional strategy is to divide the rectangle into two horizontal subrectangles. And this is among the most common compositional strategies you'll find. Here, we get a thinner rectangle below and a much taller one above. We could refer to this as a low horizon. This is a 12th century Song Dynasty drawing by Chagoué. We looked at it in an earlier lecture. The format shapes vertical to the Rembrandt's horizontal, but we find the same compositional idea. Divide the rectangle into two constituent rectangles. In this example, it occurs at the format's horizontal half. And what about the Eakins watercolor we looked at earlier? We find a similar division, near the midpoint. And note that the boat sits conveniently on the quarter. It subdivides the lower half into two more or less equal rectangles. And here's a Goya. We're in the bull ring. What do we find? Same abstract compositional structure, division at the horizontal half. This isn't just about landscape and bullfights. And here's a figure painting by Lucian Freud. What do we find? A strong division at the half, just like Chagoué about 800 years earlier. Though, unlike Chagoué, Eakins, and Goya, Freud locates his main subject in the upper half. Here's Vincent van Gogh employing the same idea as his countryman Rembrandt, but inversely. Here we have a large rectangle below, about 3/4 of the whole, and a slight one above, about 1/4, a high horizon. And note the gentle way the topography is divided or stressed at about the half and the quarter, both slightly diagonal. I've seen many students try to imitate Van Gogh's drawings. They're generally attracted to the mark making. It's very beautiful, and it's a real hallmark of Van Gogh's work. But they miss the underlying structure, this grid of horizontals and diagonals related to the format shape, which hold all those marks together. Now, I don't think anyone looking at these 6 drawings would say that they look particularly geometric, but in each case, the ostensible content, a landscape or figure, has, at an abstract level, been married to the geometric underpinnings of a given rectangle, a format shape. So, here's a useful exercise to do at this point. It's all about using a range of different rectangles and horizontal ground divisions related to the armature of the rectangle. Doing this helps you begin to develop an intuitive sense about composition. You'll be making a number of small compositional studies. So, keep the object simple. A bottle, a coffee mug, a salt shaker, or the like. We want to concentrate on the large compositional shapes. We don't want to spend a lot of time drawing intricate objects. In fact, many of the drawings you'll be making will work fine with a single object, and using some of the same objects repeatedly will heighten your awareness of how much the compositional decisions contribute to the drawing, that as opposed to the objects. For the first drawing, use one object. Make sure your table is push back against the wall, then pose the object. The goal is to find a point of view and frame with a viewfinder to capture specific compositional structures. One word of caution. Some of my students will, at first, try to create the compositional divisions with the object. That can work, but it's generally much stronger if you can do this with the large planes, the ground shapes, the tabletop and wall in a still life, the floor and wall in an interior, or the land and sky in a landscape. Let's start with a low horizon, someplace around the horizontal quarter or third, like the Rembrandt. You want to get in a position so that the division of the table and wall will be a true horizontal, not a diagonal. So you see a smaller rectangle below and a larger one above. Once you're satisfied with your point of view and framing, trace the shape of your viewfinder on your page with a 2H or 4H pencil. Then make your drawing with a somewhat softer pencil, a B or a 2B. Start with the two ground shapes, your tabletop and wall. Then give yourself a center line, relating the placement of the object to the large divisions. Then build your object using shape. Check your proportions using your center line and your negative shapes. Don't worry about shading or shadows. We just want to concentrate on moving through compositional strategies so the sense of ordering shape is embedded in the way we see the world. Now try reframing to get a mid-horizon. After completing that drawing, do a high horizon. Each time you'll have to think about how you pose the object or objects, how you position yourself, and how you change the viewfinder window's shape. The viewfinder window shape will be the shape of your drawing. So far, it's likely that your object or objects have been in the lower rectangle or straddling the two rectangles. Here's a challenge. How could you get the object in the upper rectangle? We have Freud's example to contemplate. You may have to move around a bit, but if you look up at your table from below so that the front edge of the table forms the horizontal division, you've found one solution to the problem. Or we could look down at an object on a bed or on a low table. So try another 3 drawings, low, mid, and high horizons, but this time with the object or objects occupying the upper rectangle. Of course, our primary divisions don't need to be horizontal. Here's a drawing by the American artist Norman Lundin. It's from 1974, and it's titled Modeled Standing Before a Blackboard. Note the division along the vertical half. It's accompanied by stresses at the vertical quarters. Also note the projection of light on the blackboard, pretty much parallel to the rectangle's diagonal. Most of the artists we've talked about here are long gone, but Norman Lundin's someone I've had the great good fortune to know and call a friend for close to 2 decades. He was my colleague at the University of Washington before retiring a couple of years ago. I interviewed him in 2006 for a piece that was published in a catalog on his work. This is what he had to say about composition in painting. Of course, it applies to drawing too. Quote, "Paintings are, by and large, rectangles. In both figurative and non-figurative art, being conscious that the interior rectangles and diagonals relate to the overall rectangle is an important concept. When I compose, I consciously relate the rectilinear aspects of the imagery to the edges of the painting." So, let's try this too. How could you get a vertical half? I'll give you 3 examples. I'm sure you'll be able to find many more. You could place a tall bottle, a big bottle in the foreground, then put a shorter bottle in the midground, then frame so that the edge of the tall bottle occurs at the half. We could also look down at a table and frame so that its edge creates the half. Moving from still life into an interior, we could frame so that a door opening onto an adjacent room acts as the vertical half. Another motif involves thinking of the page in terms of quadrants. Here, Leonardo locates the woods in the upper right. This kind of decision impacts the way we read the illusionistic space in the drawing. Locating the woods as he did pushes it far back in space. The blank page functions like a field we have to traverse to reach the trees. Had he drawn the woods in the lower left, the woods would appear right in front of us. So try this too. Set up an object or objects and locate the drawing in the lower left quadrant. Repeat in the upper right quadrant. Then note the difference in the way the spatial illusion appears. In the Freud, we not only get the horizontal half, the center floorboard and the white drape stress the vertical half, and the edge of the figure overlapping the white drape rides the horizontal quarter. Here's a drawing attributed to someone in Rembrandt's circle. Here we have horizontal thirds, stresses at the vertical quarters, and the figure's upper torso falls into the diagonal of the format. And here's a drawing by Rembrandt himself. The drawing's divided into vertical thirds. The figure sits in the diagonal. It's also pinned to the horizontal and vertical halves. And Picasso not only gives us vertical thirds, but sixths as well. Not to mention the stress at the vertical half, the horizontal thirds, the diagonal of the format in both directions, and the diagonals of the vertical halves. I want to be clear here. This isn't about style, period, or country. Here is from the 15th century Japanese artist Seishu Toyo, Middle Muromachi period. Like Picasso, he ties his composition to the rectangle's armature. There's a division along the horizontal half, stresses at the horizontal quarters, another along the diagonal of the format, along the diagonal of the horizontal half, along the bottom two horizontal quarters, and subtle stresses along the vertical half and quarters. A couple hundred years earlier in China, Ma Yuan composed this piece, and we find very similar divisions. Horizontal half, a stress along the diagonal of the format, others along the diagonal of the bottom horizontal halves, and a light accent at the vertical half too. So let's try all this. Your goal is to set up or find visual situations that can be framed from a specific point of view so that your drawings use horizontal thirds, vertical thirds, the diagonal of the rectangle, and quarters. Try this out when you finish this lecture. For now, let's take a look at some examples to stimulate your imagination. So here are a couple examples. We can get horizontal thirds by framing so that the top of the table is the center third, the area below it, the lower third, and the wall, the upper third. We can get vertical thirds by framing a door with equal amounts of wall on either side. You can get a diagonal by viewing your still life table from an angle and making sure the viewfinder is adjusted so that the diagonal is a diagonal of the rectangle itself. It really helps to pay attention to the large planes, like tabletops, walls, and floors, and understand them as flat shapes. To bring this home, here's a drawing by Richard Diebenkorn we looked at earlier. This isn't just a drawing of a couple nude models. It involved a very careful consideration of three interrelated things: the position of the models in the furniture, choosing the point of view, choosing the framing and format shape. The result? A tightly knit drawing that's melded to the rectangle's armature. We have stresses, things lining up, at both the vertical and horizontal halves, at the vertical and horizontal quarters, and eighths, along the format's diagonals, and along several of the diagonals of the horizontal halves, and diagonals of the vertical halves. This composition also evinces a strategy of the main division in the ground being slightly skewed. It sits along a diagonal that divides the rectangle into two wedge shapes, kind of like a guillotine blade. We find the same strategy employed in Picasso's portrait of Apollinaire. The drawings hinged on the vertical center, dividing the nose and lips in half with one eye to the right, the other to the left. The figure and chair are pegged to the vertical quarters. One arm rides the center of the right quarter while the other chair leg echoes it on the other side, riding the center of the left quarter, one side balancing out the other. Norman Lundin uses a similar wedge-shaped division in his drawing White Dough at Home. We also get stresses along the horizontal half, the vertical half, and along several of the vertical and horizontal quarters. None of the drawings we looked at would be considered geometric drawings, but they all have a strong geometric underpinning. They all rely on large shapes, usually in the ground, that are related to and construct the format shape of the drawing. So, try composing using two wedge shapes. Try a vertical version, like the Picasso, and another horizontal version, like the Lundin. You could also try varying the relative amounts of wedges. Start with both about equal, then try one small on top, big on the bottom, then the inverse. Like the artist we've been looking at, you could complement the primary wedge division with a vertical half or diagonal half or some other measure. Mix it up, and remember to consistently vary that rectangle. You can draw just about anything with this approach. Still lifes, interiors, landscapes, cityscapes, all of it. If you have someone who can pose for you, try the figure 2. If not, use a mirror and compose some self-portraits. The mirror itself can be used structurally in the composition. Another good way to develop a feel for this aspect of composition is to get reproductions of some of your favorite drawings and paintings. Put a piece of tracing paper over the reproduction. Trace the shape of the rectangle. Measure the rectangle and note the ratio of height to width. Then remove the acetate or tracing paper and draw an armature into the rectangle. You don't need every line we drew in the last lesson, but give yourself the most important ones. Then put the tracing paper back on top of the reproduction. Note what lines up with or echoes the important divisions and directions. Most drawings are constructed with some kind of hierarchy in mind, and our discussion of the armature and large compositional shapes leads quite naturally to a discussion of focal area and focal point. There's a reason why most people looking at a drawing aren't even aware of the ground. It's because artists purposely construct their drawings so that we focus on the object. But the artist has to pay a lot of attention to both so that the viewer experiences the hierarchy of the visual events in a specific way. In Aiken's watercolor, the focal point is Bigland's head and upper torso. Focal area is Bigland and his skull. We've noted that the two large rectangular ground shapes hinge near the horizontal half. The drawings also clearly hinge to the vertical half. The figure grouping, Bigland and his boat, sit into a rectangle. Our main character sits into a central triangle within this. Aikens has positioned Bigland's shoulder and arm directly below the format center so that they echo the page's diagonal. He's also placed the oar parallel to the diagonal of the figure's rectangle. All in all, lots of triangles. This means lots of diagonals in this part of the image. The reason's clear. Bigland's a focal point. Aikens also wants to express energy and movement. The guy's an athlete. He's rowing. So the choice is not only rational, but expressive of the content. We have a second figure group in the distance made up of 3 boats and landscape events. This sits into a rectangle as well, a smaller one, more horizontal one. The major stresses are more horizontal and vertical, very stable, less eye-grabbing. There are a couple minor diagonals in the distant boats. This helps to make them more compelling than the even quieter landscape beyond. In the Indian drawing, the man and woman are the focal point. They form a central triangle with attention-grabbing diagonals. This drawing, too, is hinged at the center. The place where the 2 lovers touch hands is dead center, with their arms paralleling the vertical and diagonal centers, respectively. Adding the still life objects, we get a larger focal area that sits into a square centered in the large rectangle. The still life objects form a rectangular subcompartment. The Rembrandt follows a similar strategy. The focal point, Saskia's head and upper torso. Where do we find it? In the center. What kind of shape is it related to? A triangle. Picasso follows suit. The model's the focal point. She's placed in the center. She's constructed using sets of triangles. The Rembrandt, the Punjab Hills drawings, the Aikens, and the Picasso are all stylistically different, but they follow similar underlying compositional strategies, similar abstract strategies. In these cases, that means locating the focal point in focal areas in the center and hinging these to diagonals associated with the rectangle. That brings us to the next set of drawing projects. The idea is to extend on what we did in the last set of compositional exercises. You'll introduce more complexity in terms of the objects and their relationships. The goal is to select objects, pose them, select a point of view, and frame them so that there's a natural hierarchy to the organization. This means that, relative to the large ground shapes, you'll have a focal point and focal area. Start with still life. 3 to 5 objects will work well. Once you've done this observationally, try it again from your imagination. You can invent objects of differing shapes and sizes so that they create a natural hierarchy relative to the ground in the drawing. You can also go back and consult your earlier drawings, both from life and from your imagination, and begin composing using them as source material. We've seen that the center of the format is a very important place. That's not to say that artists always locate their focal point in the center, though often drawings find their balance in relationship to it, and balance is a key compositional concept. We can imagine the bottom horizontal of the format as a plank sitting on a fulcrum. Every line or mark that we make has what we refer to as visual weight. That's another important compositional concept. And just about all the artworks you know are structured to balance in one way or another. You won't see that plank tipping too much this way or too much that way. There are many options in structuring balance. In the Bigland watercolor, Aiken's strategy is based on centering, complemented by the use of counterweights left and right. Bigland occupies the center, balanced. The thrust of his arm on the left is counterbalanced by the oar on the right. In the foreground, we get the major weight in the center, Bigland's reflection. There are equal counterweight reflections left and right, balanced. On the water behind him, we get the portion of the cropped skull and the long skull on the left. That's countered by the two sailboats on the right. The events in the landscape and sky balance out as well. In this drawing by Norman Lundin, we get a balance which is symmetrical in nature. The two figures balance each other out. Now, too much symmetricality can be monotonous, but managed artfully, it can serve as a strong basis for a composition. The obvious symmetricality is offset by the way the figures twist in opposing directions in space, one forward, one away. That's complemented by the differences in the position of the arms and the feet. While not as symmetrical as a Lundin, this Rembrandt is by no means asymmetrical. It's still a drawing where the visual weights are balanced out right and left. The big division in the ground occurs at about the horizontal third. That gives us a small rectangle below and a larger one above, about twice as big. The large tree sits just off center with the limb on the right tied to the format's diagonal. The right side of the tree balances with the left. The bifurcated buildings, divided by the tree's trunk, balances out left and right, as do the buildings on the left with the horse and the cart on the right. In this brush painting by Zhao Mengfu, the large division in the ground occurs at about the 3/4 mark. This divides land from sky. Here too, we get balance from the center, but the hierarchy is inverted. The focal points are on the right and left. The foreground landscape grouping on the right is counterbalanced by the colophon and the distant mountains on the left. Lundin's model standing before a blackboard embraces a greater degree of asymmetry. The drawing hinges along that vertical half. The full weight of the figure is on the right, but it's counterbalanced by the visual weight of the notations and play of light on the chalkboard. In this drawing, the figure splays right and left of center, balancing out around it. The triangular shape of the floor and the wall molding provide an added counterweight to the portion of the figure on the right. This other drawing by Aikens is more asymmetrical, but not without balance. The two rowers and most of their skull weigh down on the left, as does the small boat in the upper left. To balance this out, Aikens adds a second long skull horizontal and straddling the center, and a tugboat and large paddle boat anchored on the right. It's worth noting here that the large division is a variation of the high horizon, dividing the rectangle into two primary rectangles, a larger lower one, about 2/3, and a smaller higher one, about 1/3. Everything we've discussed so far has to do with ordering and balancing things in relationship to a given rectangle. In that sense, composing a drawing is a lot like arranging furniture, which we do in relation to the proportions of a given room. How we arrange the furniture depends on the room itself. What kind of rectangle is it? How long? How wide? We also create aggregate groupings and relationships when we arrange furniture. In your living room, for instance, You position the area rug, sofa, coffee table, and armchair so that the individual objects form a grouping. Similarly, in your office, you relate the chair to the desk, to the computer table, to the file cabinet. It's all about establishing relationships. There's generally a hierarchy here, too. Most drawings, prints, and paintings are rectangles, and most artists structure their compositions in relationship to the specific rectangle they're chosen. Though in most cases, as with the works we've been looking at, they don't end up looking geometric. But the act of composition seeks to tie the specific subject matter to the underlying structure of the given rectangle. The structure generally remains hidden, that is, unless you look for it. Kind of like the 2x4s and joists on the walls and floors of your homes. Most of us don't tend to think about them much, but they're really holding all the stuff we see on the surface, the wallpaper, moldings, paneling, mirrors. It's holding all of that together. Learning to draw is a bit like learning to juggle. You have to keep a number of balls in the air at the same time. There's a choice of a particular rectangle, the format shape. Then there are the large ground divisions. Next, we have to think about the internal aggregate shape or shapes and how these relate to the armature. All of the above is often related to a consideration of focal point and focal area. And now we have to start to think about structural balance. This leads us to our next drawing exercise. The goals to pose your still life objects, find a point of view, and frame to make 3 new studies. For the first, try symmetry. Next, try one that's balanced. It could have elements of symmetry, but it shouldn't be truly symmetrical. Last, structure a composition that's clearly asymmetrical, but also balanced. Once you've done this from observation, try it from your imagination using the constructive methods we've covered earlier. There are a couple key points to consider when working on compositional problems like the ones we've covered in this lecture. You want to choose what you draw very carefully. Take time to select a point of view and framing. Think about those large planes and planar divisions, the tabletop and wall in a still life, the floor and the wall or walls in an interior, and the large divisions of land and sky in a landscape. Relate observed reality to large geometric shapes and draw through the format in sympathy with this. And here are some questions you can ask yourself as a guide in critiquing your own work. First, is the whole format activated? Are there dead areas? Does a composition balance? Does a drawing feel alive and fresh? Is there a unique perception or point of view? Have you taken care to bring this perception to life on the page? Is there a focal point and focal area? Is there a strong sense of design in the composition that directs the viewer to move through the drawing in a particular order? Have you looked at what you're drawing closely with an intelligent and analytic eye? Do your objects sit convincingly in relationship to the large planes? Are you creating space and volume convincingly? And have you been attentive to clarifying overlap situations? All these questions will help you identify problems in your work and improve the results.